J. Basanko, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Archives and Records Administration. On behalf of the National Archives, Arlington National Cemetery, and the Naval History and Heritage Command, I would like to welcome you to today's program on the sinking of the USS Maine. On the 125th anniversary of this event, it is important to reflect not only on the implications of this event on our history, but also the personal stories of those affected. My great-great-uncles, Martin Toohey and John Joseph Toohey, emigrated from Ireland and served in the United States Navy on the USS Maine. On February 15, 1898, when the explosion occurred, Martin Toohey was aboard the ship as a coal passer. He perished by drowning in the explosion. I learned about Martin's story through the efforts of his mother, Margaret, who wrote about him in support of her pension application to the United States government following his death. That pension file and many others are preserved at the National Archives. Margaret and her family were only one of the over 260 American families who lost loved ones on the Maine and whose stories continue to echo through today. The sinking of the USS Maine was not only an event with implications on the global stage, it was a personal tragedy for each of those families. It is my honor to participate in the events commemorating the USS Maine, the lives lost, and the impact of this singular tragedy on national and global history. This event, sponsored jointly by our three agencies, represents one of the many ways that we all preserve and make accessible the documentary history of our nation. I hope you enjoy the presentations by our expert speakers, and thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, and thank you for listening in. I'm Dr. John Fahey, and on behalf of the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, I am honored to introduce the ship that we're all here to discuss. The USS Maine is one of the most remembered ships in U.S. history. Unlike the Constitution, the Monitor, or the Enterprise, though, it is not remembered for valiant wartime service, but rather for exploding in a foreign port and sparking a war. While we usually remember Maine due to this tragedy, it's a fascinating ship on its own merits. Today I'll discuss a bit of Maine's history before explaining why the ship went to Havana in January of 1898 and what it did there up until the night of 15 February. USS Maine was built at an interesting time. After the U.S. Civil War, the Navy suffered under severe budget cuts that left it with ancient wooden warships. In the 1880s, though, Congress started funding the so-called New Steel Navy of cruisers and battleships. Maine and Texas, you can see Maine right there, the plan anyway. So Maine and Texas were the first U.S. battleships built. Maine was bigger than Texas. So at the time, it was the largest warship ever built by the United States. By today's standard, the ship was fairly small, about 6,600 tons and 320 feet long. That's about two-thirds the size of a modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. It had an eclectic assortment of weapons, ranging from 10-inch cannons to Gatling guns, and an unusual lopsided arrangement that you can see on the gun plan there. Maine was laid down in 1888 and launched 18 November 1890. 20,000 people attended the launching ceremony, which you can see there, overseen by Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Tracy. His granddaughter, 12-year-old Alice Tracy Wilmerding, christened the ship Maine. Since American industry is not fully ready to equip a battleship, though, it took 5 years for U.S. companies to produce the engines, armaments, and fittings for the ship. You can see the scale of it there to kind of see the problem, I guess. The armor alone required 3 years due to the difficulties in procuring nickel and steel. Some of Maine's fittings were new technology and thus particularly hard to acquire. For example, the ship needed about 400 light fixtures, just over a decade after Thomas Edison had built the first incandescent light bulbs. Now, Maine is a good representation of U.S. industry and naval power in the early 1900s. The crew is likewise a good representation of U.S. society at the time. Maine was commissioned on 17 September 1895 as a second-class battleship, and then became the home of 31 officers and 346 sailors and Marines, although that number does fluctuate over the years. The crew was recruited from across the United States and the world. Almost a quarter were born outside the country, a marker of the heavy pace of immigration around the turn of the century. Maine had multiple crewmen from Ireland, Sweden, Germany, Japan, Norway, Denmark, Canada, England, France, and Greece, and other crewmen from other countries. 30 crewmen were African Americans. The officers were an interesting mix of the contemporary U.S. Navy. Maine's first captain, Arndt S. Crowninshield, was a New Yorker and a veteran of the Civil War, as was the ship's second captain, Charles Sigsbee. The first executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Adolph Merricks, was the first Jewish graduate of the Naval Academy, and Chaplain John P. Chidwick was one of the first Roman Catholic chaplains in the Navy. Life on Maine was a lot like life on any Navy ship, with endless watch, drill, and training. The ship itself spent its relatively short career heading up and down the East Coast, getting repaired, refueling, and training naval militiamen. One story may resonate with today's sailors or anyone who's met a sailor. In November of 1895, Maine was sent to the state of Maine to meet with Governor Henry B. Cleves. Traditionally, ships were given a punch bowl by their namesake, but since Maine was a prohibition state at the time, Governor Cleves presented the ship with a set of silver vegetable dishes and a large soup tureen, which you can see here. Chaplain Chidwick recalled later that from then on, Maine, quote, provided for our guests aboard ship a peculiar quality of soup, which had neither vegetables nor meat as component parts. It was exceedingly cheerful in spirit and seemed to be the constant center of attraction to the guests who favored us by their presence. Maine's officers and men held parties, visited New Orleans for Mardi Gras, and fulfilled their Navy duties. Maine also had some close calls, like the time that 3 men were washed overboard and lost in a storm off South Carolina, or the time that Captain Sigsbee rammed a pier in New York Harbor to avoid sinking a ferry full of tourists. All in all, the ship would have had a fairly typical career in the new and expanding American Navy if it wasn't for the Cuban insurrection. Throughout much of the 19th century, Spain had fought a brutal counterinsurgency against Cuban revolutionaries seeking independence. American newspapers and the public became increasingly worried about Spanish abuses of Cuban civilians, particularly as Cuba was governed by General Weyler from 1896 to 1897. Nicknamed the Butcher by the American press, Weyler instituted a policy of reconcentración, forcing civilians out of the countryside to live in camps controlled by Spanish forces. Reconcentración decimated Cuba, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, failed to end the insurgency, and inspired the use of similar concentration camps across the world. The U.S. government struggled to know how to deal with the humanitarian and diplomatic complexities of this situation. Now, Weyler was recalled in October of 1897 by a new liberal government in Spain, which also granted Cuba a degree of autonomy and a new governor. While these changes were an improvement, Cuba was still unstable, and U.S.-Spanish relations remained strained. Maine was ordered in October of 1897 to be ready to intervene or assist American citizens and interests on the island, as decided by President William McKinley. After a few scares, the ship was ordered to make a friendly port visit in January 1898 to Havana. Maine arrived in Cuba on 25 January. Despite some anti-Spanish feelings on board, no member of the crew reported any significant anti-American demonstration while Maine was in Havana. Once anchored at buoy number 4, which you can see here to the left of the city by the little X there, Captain Sigsbee went ashore to visit local officials. He also ordered the crew to remain vigilant, allowed no shore leave, and took extra precautions against sabotage. A few sailors went ashore to buy supplies, and officers made social visits to the city, where they watched a bullfight and met victims of Spain's reconcentración policy. Over the next few weeks, as officers visited Havana and locals visited the Maine, U.S.-Spanish relations improved in some ways. According to President McKinley, Maine's visit was a success, creating, quote, a feeling of relief and confidence following the resumption of the long-interrupted friendly intercourse. Towards mid-February, the crew began to look forward to revisiting New Orleans for Mardi Gras. They would not get the chance. Nathaniel Patch of the National Archives will take the story from here. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathaniel Patch. I am the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard subject matter expert for the National Archives in College Park. The story of the Maine continues. On the evening of February 15th, 1898, started out as a quiet night with most of the enlisted crew in their hammocks and the night watch milling about on deck. The calm was broken by a thunderous explosion as the USS Maine ripped apart from the forward section out. the upper decks folded back on it, and the bow came to settle in the harbor. As the surviving crew took stock of their situation, getting the lifeboats ready and hopefully preparing to fight the fire, they noticed the debris and the flotsam and jetsam in the harbor, and took notice of the white shirts of the wounded, dead, and drowning sailors. As the realization of the explosion was settling in, neighboring ships like the city of Washington and the Spanish cruiser Alphonse XII sprang to life to help with the rescue. In the end, 266 out of the 354 officers and sailors perished that night. The Secretary of the Navy, John Long, immediately called for a court of inquiry. The head of this court was Captain William T. Sampson. He and his investigators interviewed surviving crew members and officers, and those who were at the harbor and observed the explosion, as well as taking into account the physical remnants of the Maine itself. They came to the conclusion that the Maine was blown up by a mine placed by people unknown, primarily because of a piece of keel at the 18th frame that was bent upwards, as being the epicenter of the explosion. As the Sampson Board was conducting their investigation, the Spanish was conducting theirs. Their conclusions were that the Maine had exploded from the inside because there was no geyser caused by a mine. There are no dead fish in the harbor, which would have been killed by the shockwave. And they also concluded that no person could have placed a mine large enough to sink the Maine without anybody noticing. But in the United States, the yellow journalists had already been fanning the flames towards war, and the sinking of the Maine and the return of the remains of the sailors only can fan the flames higher. There was a huge public outcry of remember the Maine, and the papers were now pushing for even stronger for the independence and autonomy of Cuba, and the removal of Spain from the Caribbean. The call for war reached a fever pitch between the yellow journalism and the indecisive Sampson report. President McKinley found himself in a very precarious position, under pressure from Congress and the American public to intervene in Cuba. In April 1898, there was a quick cascade into war from McKinley's ultimatum on April 20th to the Spanish severing diplomatic ties on April 21st, and then eventually declaring war as the United States began their blockade of Cuba. The Spanish-American War lasted 110 days, ending on August 13th, and with the Treaty of Paris signed in December. The sinking of the Maine and the loss of life has cemented itself as being the cause of the Spanish-American War, much in the same way that Pearl Harbor is to World War II and the Tonkin Gulf is to Vietnam. In 1911, there was a call for the salvage of the Maine from Havana Harbor, primarily to get the remains of the few sailors that were still trapped in the hull, and to finally get a definitive answer as to what sank the Maine. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a cofferdam around the Maine, and they were able to inspect the wreckage. The Members of the Bureau of Construction and Repair, like William Ferguson, were able to take extensive photographs of the wreck. But in the end, the investigation came to the same conclusion as the Sampson Board, which that an external mine was used to blow up the Maine, again by persons unknown. In 1974, an article about the sinking of the Maine caught the attention of Admiral Hyman Rickover of the Navy's Nuclear Propulsion Division. He and his researchers from the Naval Sea Systems Command researched historical records, including Ferguson's photographs. The researchers had extensive knowledge of war damage, particularly from mines and torpedoes from 2 world wars, and they could quickly assess that the wreckage of the Maine was caused by an internal explosion rather than an external one caused by a mine. They concluded that it was as a result of a coal bunker fire lighting off the nearby magazine sharing the same bulkhead. The legacy of the Maine is that it was an accidental opportunity during a time of tense situation in Cuba that ignited the Spanish-American War, ushering in the United States as a global power in the 20th century.
Hello, my name is Steve Carney, and I'm the command historian at Arlington National Cemetery. I'm standing in front of Section 24, where 230 crew members who were killed during the explosion of the USS Maine are buried. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about the cemeterial response to the Maine's explosion and how and why these crew members are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In the aftermath of the Maine's explosion, due to Spanish policy, burials had to be made within 24 hours. Therefore, the initial crew that were recovered in the aftermath of the disaster were quickly buried at the Colón Cemetery in Havana. Here we see images of several crew members from the initial recovery efforts lying in state at the City Hall in Havana. And in the second image, we see the funeral procession through the town on the way to Colón Cemetery on February 17th of 1898. During the remainder of the month of February, a total of 166 crew member remains were located and interred at the Colón Cemetery. This photo, taken later in 1898, shows the burial plot for the Maine crew. The casketed remains were buried in several grave sites around this cross, which read, "Victims of the Maine." Beginning in March, additional remains that were recovered were sent to Key West, Florida, rather than being interred in Havana. Captain Charles Sigsbee had complained earlier to the American Secretary of the Navy about the treatment of American remains that were recovered in mid-February, but he did not have the resources to move those remains to the U.S. for burial. As a result, however, by March, any additional remains that were located were sent for burial at the Key West Cemetery. This film shows the funeral procession and Navy escort of 9 crew members through the town of Key West on March 27th. All of the remains recovered after the end of February of 1898 were interred at the Key West Cemetery. However, all operations or searches for additional crew members' remains were suspended at the beginning of April. In total, 24 crew members were recovered in March of 1898 and were buried at Key West. In the cemetery, 2 of those 24 were known and are buried in individual grave sites. The remainder were all unknown. In these photos, we see one of the early burials at the cemetery and what the plot ended up looking like in about 1901, which included all of the grave sites as well as a memorial that was erected in honor of the Maine victims. After the peace treaty with Spain went into effect on April 11th, 1899, the United States government began to repatriate service members who fell overseas during the conflict to the United States at the government's expense, at no cost to the families. One of the reasons for this is another piece of Spanish policy was that no disinterments could be made for a certain number of years after a burial. So now that Spain no longer administered Cuba or the Philippines, that was no longer a concern. One of the early repatriations that occurred was of the original 166 crew members who had been interred in the Cologne Cemetery during February of 1898. In total, 165 of those 166 crew members were brought to Arlington National Cemetery for burial on December 28th of 1899 in what we at the time was called the Maine section, but of course today we call section 24. Disinterments were completed in the Cologne Cemetery on December 17th of 1899, and the 151 caskets that were disinterred were sent towards Arlington. They arrived on December 27th and were guarded overnight, while the funeral service and burials were conducted then on December 28th. This is an image of our December 1899 monthly report on burials at ANC, and you can see that in total, 165 Maine victims were buried here that month. 63 were known and 102 were unknown. Of note, it's also interesting to see that at the time, there were 17,720 individuals interred at the cemetery. In order to commemorate the establishment of the Maine section and the 165 crew members that were interred there, an early memorial comprised of an anchor and 2 captured Spanish mortars was dedicated. During the late 19th and early 20th century, it was very common at ANC for a memorial to be dedicated when a new burial section was created. That, however, is not the end of the story of the burials at ANC. During the salvage operations of the Maine, which we'll hear about in a later presentation, the remains of an additional 65 crew members were recovered throughout 1911 and were kept under American guard at the Fortress of La Cabana in Havana. After making preparations, the casketed remains were brought to the pier in Havana on March 16th of 1912 and were sent to the Washington Navy Yard, where they arrived on March 23rd of 1912. Here we see images of the procession of the casketed remains to the pier in Havana, and then the disembarking off of the USS Birmingham at the Washington Navy Yard. After arriving at the Navy Yard, a funeral procession snaked through Washington, D.C., and ultimately to ANC. Along the way, a funeral service was held near the State, War, and Navy Department building, which today is the site of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. After arriving at ANC, the final 65 service members of the Maine's crew were laid to rest and joined their 165 shipmates who had been buried in 1899. In this photo, we see the preparation of those grave sites in Section 24. And here is a modern view of Section 24 today, with all 230 crew members interred there. This daily burial log from ANC on March 23rd of 1912 shows the burial of the 65 remains in a total of 34 caskets. Arlington offers a unique perspective on the Spanish-American War. There really are no other sites in the United States that tell as comprehensive of a story as we do here. Not only are the USS Maine crew members interred here, but also soldiers, sailors, Marines, and nurses from the conflict are buried nearby. In addition to those grave sites, we also are a major site of commemoration and memorialization of the war. We have 5 individual memorials here dedicated to the conflict. 2 to the USS Maine, 1 to the war itself, 1 to the Rough Riders, and 1 to the Spanish-American War nurses. You can learn about all these connections between ANC and the conflict through our education program, which is available at education.arlingtoncemetery.mil.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lynn Rowe. I am a reference archivist with the Old Navy Maritime Team at the National Archives at Washington, D.C. Today, I will be talking to you about the sinking of the USS Maine, records at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and providing you with just a few examples of the records we house here at our research facility. Overall, our records consist of documents relating to the USS Maine and its design, the events before and after the explosion, the recovery efforts for both men and ship, the Navy's investigation of the incident, and records relating to the implementation of memorials. Our first set of examples can be found in Record Group 24, Records of the Bureau of Naval Personnel. In Entry 118, Logbooks of U.S. Navy Ships, we see records which can provide researchers with the logistical day-to-day operation of a ship. Records are arranged alphabetically according to ship's name, hull number, or station, and thereunder chronologically. While logbooks of the USS Maine stop at the end of 1897, researchers can instead look at the records of vessels used during the rescue, recovery, and salvage of the USS Maine. Entry 98, correspondence relating to naval personnel listed in the sinking of the Maine. Records are arranged alphabetically by person's name. Within the series, there are folders for individual men who were lost during the explosion. These folders hold letters of condolences and offers of relief, money to surviving family members. There is information relating to next of kin and letters from family members thanking relief societies. These letters often provide descriptions of family relationship and their hardships following the Maine's explosion. Researchers will also find many family letters to and from foreign countries. Entry 88 and 89, general correspondence. These records are arranged chronologically and thereunder by file number. As you can see, these two series will overlap in dates. Both files relate to casualty lists, requests for such lists, memorial services, plaques, monuments, and awards. Next, we have Record Group 45, Naval Records Collections of the Office of Naval Records and Libraries. Entry 502, subject files are among the most utilized and accessible records relating to Old Navy records here in DC. These records are arranged by subject based on an alphabetical classification scheme developed by the Office of Naval Records and Libraries. Examples are included in this slide. Entry 60, cipher messages received and translated, are arranged chronologically. The majority of messages were sent by officers in command of squadrons and/or vessels stationed in the South Atlantic, Caribbean, and Pacific stadiums. Most of the messages were received directly by the Secretary's office, and other records were received by the Bureau of Navigation and forwarded to the Secretary. Entry 517, area file of the Naval Records Collection, are arranged by geographical area and thereunder chronologically. Records have been reformatted in microfilm publication M625. These records consist of letters, telegrams, radio messages, and maps removed or copied from the Office of Secretary of the Navy, Bureau of Navigation, Office of Naval Intelligence, and other naval departments. Next, we have Record Group 125, Records of the Navy Judge Advocate General. Entry 30, Records of the Proceedings of Court of Inquiry, Board of Investigation, and Board of Inquest. Records are arranged by case file number. The USS Maine's case file number 4950 takes up two boxes. The first box has records relating to the testimonial of survivors, witnesses, and those who assisted with the recovery of the ship. The second part of the box consists of conclusions of the investigation. The second box has photos of the vessel's remains. An example of one of the photos is included in this slide. As we mentioned before, these were just a few examples of the records relating to the USS Maine. Here are some additional record groups that also relate to the ship and its explosion. For more information relating to our records, researchers can contact us at archives1reference@nara.gov. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Hello, my name is David Langbart. I work in research services at the National Archives. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you about Department of State records relating to the USS Maine. The records on the Maine fall into 3 different iterations of the department's central files from the late 19th century to the 1930s. Next slide, please. One of those covers the years 1783 to 1906. In 1898, because Cuba was a colony of Spain, the highest-ranking American there was Consul General Fitzhugh Lee in Havana. Lee was the nephew of Robert E. Lee and a former Confederate general himself. Among Lee's dispatches or reports from Havana, we find his account of the explosion and immediate follow-up. Those begin with his telegram announcing the explosion, and subsequent reports deal with the recovery and burial of the bodies and initial planning on how to deal with the wreckage. His reporting ends fairly soon as the Consulate General closed with the advent of war with Spain. Upon his return to the United States, Lee became one of 4 former Confederate generals who became major generals of U.S. volunteers during the war, although he saw no action himself. In other series of records from this time period are the messages of condolence from other countries. Those messages were transmitted to the U.S. either through American diplomatic and consular officials or by foreign diplomatic officials in the United States. Next slide, please. The records of the Maine continue in the department's numerical file, which dates from the years 1906 to 1910. Within that large set of records, file 11893 deals with the subject of the wrecks of the Spanish warships on the Cuban coast and the USS Maine. Among the issues discussed in the file are what to do with the wrecks and who owns them. Next slide, please. The Department of State adopted a new filing system in 1910, the Central Decimal File. Within those records, there are 2 different files on the subject of the Maine. One, file 811.304M28, is the continuation of numerical file 11893 in the later period. A second, altogether new file, 837.413M28, is about the USS Maine Memorial in Cuba. In later years, that file includes documentation on the annual ceremonies commemorating the sinking. Next slide, please. Some of the records I've discussed are available online. All of the central file records dating to 1906 can be viewed through various series in the National Archives catalog. This includes Lee's dispatches and the condolence messages, as well as the extensive diplomatic record relating to the Spanish-American War. Numerical file 11893 is online too. Sadly, the Central Decimal File records on the Maine are not available online. The series Foreign Relations of the United States, the official documentary history of U.S. foreign policy, prepared and issued by the Department of State, includes a selection of documents from all 3 time periods and is available online. The URLs for the online resources and foreign relations are noted on this slide. I hope you found this information useful. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, my name is Ivor Mollema. I work as an underwater archaeologist at the Underwater Archaeology Branch of the Naval History and Heritage Command. Today I'm talking to you about the ultimate fate of the Maine. So we already covered its sinking. So I'm going to be talking about its recovery efforts, where it ultimately ended up, and some of the memorialization that happened after it was raised. So just a quick timeline. As we've already covered, the Maine sank on the 15th of February, 1898. On the 10th of December, 1898, the Spanish-American War ends and the Maine remains in Havana Harbor. It wasn't until the 9th of May, 1910, that U.S. Congress authorized funds totaling at the time about $650,000 in total for the recovery of Maine. In June, the cofferdam was completed. And then finally in March of 1912, the Maine was resunk, and it was ultimately rediscovered about 88 years later. So as part of the recovery efforts, it remained in Havana Harbor after the 1898 war. It was a clear shipping hazard. There was risk of shoaling because sand and silt and other sediments were collecting on the wreck, and it would create a shoal that would inhibit shipping in the harbor. It was also protruding above the water, so ships couldn't simply sail over it for risk of damaging their hulls. And then finally, Congress was under pressure from a number of patriotic groups, including veterans of the war and other groups and interested parties, to raise the Maine for the collection of souvenirs. This also went hand in hand with the hopeful recovery of about 70 bodies that still remained on board the Maine that had not been recovered after its initial sinking. So finally, on the 13th of October 1911, following a long logistical process of getting equipment down to Havana, renting equipment or boats from the Cuban government, the cofferdam was started. On the 7th of June, it was completed. You can see here at the bottom picture that shows a picture probably around July or August of the cofferdam pictures. You see the kind of cylinders that I'll talk about a little bit later, but note the boats and the pumping stations kind of surrounding the cofferdam that were all essential to completing this project. And for those that don't know, a cofferdam is essentially you build a dam in the middle of some water and then pump it out so that the dam keeps the water out, and you can remove the water from within the dam. As you can see, that's what's happening here. That allows then essentially terrestrial or land access to the shipwreck itself on the bottom. So that's what's happening here. Finally, in 1911, after a lot of effort, the stern section, which was the most intact of the Maine, is refloated. This involved the creation of a concrete and wooden plug, effectively, which helped to reseal the Maine. As a quick fun side note, the engines on board the Maine, despite having been underwater for almost 14 years at that point, fired up again, and they were able to use it to transport the Maine and drain some of the last remaining water out of the Maine. So I'm sure the manufacturer was thrilled to hear that at the time. Now, as a final note on this slide, the picture in the top right-hand side here is what the Maine looked like following the war in 1898. As you can see, it's a clear shipping hazard. It sticks out. We have documents here of letters to U.S. Navy personnel requesting permission to dynamite the remains of the Maine as soon as almost November 1898. So at that point, they were already thinking about clearing the harbor and clearing the debris out of the way. At that point, the Navy said no, for the clear reason that there is still UXO on board, and if dynamite is applied, we don't know what's going to happen there. And then finally, the ultimate reason as well was that there was still remains of sailors on board that they didn't want to disturb in that way. So quick note on the cofferdam, you see two images here. On the left-hand side, this one's a little bit later. So the previous image was in August. This is probably a little later, say in late August or early September, judging by the water level. You can see some of the remains of the Maine getting exposed in the fore and middle ground of the photo. Again, note that there's cranes and other boats surrounding the cofferdam to assist in this project. But the cofferdam itself, as you can kind of tell here, was constructed of 20 steel cylinders that were sunk about 38 feet into the harbor, which meant that they sat in or on top of the harbor bottom. They're each 50 feet wide, and they would be filled with gravel and clay. That in itself delayed the construction of the cofferdam, as it was thought that they could simply pull up clay and gravel and sediment from the bottom of Havana Harbor and fill the cylinders with that material. Unfortunately, that proved too much for the pumping equipment at the time, and replacement pumps would have cost $1,800 a day to be rented, which was a prohibitive cost. So they ended up pumping it in a different way, but simply filling it with clay that came in through lumps. So it took much longer to fill the drums, and then much slower to fill or empty the cofferdam of water afterwards as well. Ultimately, as the water level inside the dam decreases, the water pressure on the outside of the drums increases. It was calculated at the time that there was probably about 4,000 pounds of water pressure per drum being enacted on there as the water level was decreased to the 38 feet below. They would have stopped at about 5 feet below the sea level there to check for any leaks. None were found at the time, or no serious leaks were found at the time, so they were able to patch anything. But when they resumed pumping, the increased pressure as they lowered the water inside increased to such a degree that significant leaking occurred, and they had to slowly pump the water away at a rate of less than 1 foot per hour, with frequent stops to patch leaks and reinforce the material. As the water got even lower, it was realized that extra bracing, in this case it would have been wooden bracing, was required to keep the steel drums in place and from collapsing on each other. So they would have put wooden beams in between some of the steel drums to add that extra bracing to counter the increasing water pressure. At that point, it was thought that they might not be able to recover the wreckage, and the wreckage was examined in that 1911 examination that was already covered earlier. It should also be noted that this was an Army Corps of Engineers project with Navy assistance. So several Navy engineers were involved with it. The investigation did also involve ship architects hired or selected by the Navy to have a good view at the wreckage and come to the best possible conclusion. The picture on the bottom here is near the completion of the draining of the cofferdam, and it shows the starboard side of the Maine, which is its most intact. You can tell that it's still fairly intact here. It's probably towards the stern section, but you can see two sailors in the kind of middle of the photo, and then towards the bottom right of the photo, simply standing on the wreckage, showing that there is still a fair amount of structural integrity in that part of the wreck. However, as you would have moved forward to the bow, that wreckage would not have been structurally integral, and that was actually cut away using torches by the Army Corps of Engineers team. So finally, it is raised in October of 1911, and it is decided that it needs to be resunk or redeposited somewhere else. This occurs ultimately on the 12th of March, 1912. When the Maine was raised using the pumps that were on board, it was also plugged and prepared for sinking in various ways. One of those was actually they had to cut away parts of the hull structure to counter the pressure of suction from the mud of the bottom. And those hulls were then plugged with wooden plugs, which they then removed to resink or redeposit the Maine later. So on the 12th of March, the Maine was pulled out of Havana Harbor. They were hoping to pull it out a little bit further, but being as they are pulling a literal wreck that is counterbalanced in various ways, it was tough going, and at 4 miles, they decided to sink it there. It was escorted by the U.S. Navy ships North Carolina and Birmingham, which provided a 21-gun salute as the Maine sunk to the bottom of Cuban waters. At the time, it was sunk in what was measured to be 100 fathoms, or between 3,600 and 3,700 feet of seawater, so well out of the way of any potential navigational hazards for the time. The picture on the right here shows the last image of the Maine with an ensign flying as it is resunk about 4 miles from Havana. It is then ultimately rediscovered in October of 2000 by a team from the University of South Florida that partnered with an underwater exploration team, ADC, and partnered with the Cuban government to test some underwater exploration equipment. As they were scanning the seafloor, they ran across the Maine, which was unmistakable due to its clear structure. It would literally look like a ship that had been cut off, which was the case here. It also had a debris field of coal and an associated boiler with it. And at that point, it was actually discovered about a mile east of where it was originally sunk. So the theory is that it was sunk in the correct position, but in that 3,700 feet of seawater, it could have drifted significantly. and ultimately been deposited about a mile away from its original sinking location. So we already spoke a little bit about the motivations for the recovery of the Maine, which included the shipping hazard and the recovery of the 70 bodies on board, which were all recovered. Only one was identified. The rest were then buried in Arlington. But another motivation to raise the Maine was for patriotic groups to acquire souvenirs. Now, this isn't a practice we really do anymore, but it was widespread and prevalent at the time to have souvenirs like this. You can see two here that are examples of what we have from the USS Maine in the Washington Navy Yard. So on the left here is the cover of a capstan that is located in the rare book room of the library. And on the right here is a spare propeller blade from the USS Maine on display in the gun yard that we have here at the Washington Navy Yard. Two of the other notable examples for memorialization of the Maine are the foremast that sits in the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which is pictured on the left here, and the mainmast of the Maine that is pictured on the right here, which is located at the Maine Monument in Arlington. So those are two of the principal ones. Other examples include several 6-pounder guns that were recovered. One sits in Bangor, Maine at a monument. Another sits in New York, somewhere in the state as a monument, and several others are spread out as well. Some souvenirs were recovered. Some shells are documented to have been recovered and become part of memorials around the country. A museum in Maine actually has a porthole cover, along with several other artifacts from the ship. And then ultimately, some bronze plaques were also printed by the Navy independently to confirm that some of these items or memorials were of and for the Maine. And those became part of that kind of memorialization effort as well. So you can see here, they're in fairly good shape. They've been maintained fairly well. But these masts and everything is what is left of the Maine ultimately, and is where you could visit a piece of history should you so choose.
Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation on the documentary history related to the USS Maine, jointly sponsored by Arlington National Cemetery, the National Archives and Records Administration, and the U.S. Navy Naval History and Heritage Command. We will now move on to the question and answer portion of today's event. I'm Megan Guthorn, and I will serve as your moderator today. If you have a question for our speakers, please add it to the chat box. We will start with a question for Nate. Was the USS Maine the first all-steel warship in the U.S. Navy to be sunk in such a violent manner?
I think so. There doesn't seem to be any predecessor. Certainly during the American Civil War, there were any number of monitors and ironclad ships that were destroyed, but they were not totally made from metal, and they were not certainly built and constructed in the same way that the Maine and the Texas were. So this was an unusual event, and we would not have any basis of comparison until the First World War. So.
Thank you. I think the next question is for John. Could you tell us a little bit about what else is happening to commemorate the Maine today?
Oh yeah, of course, I'm glad to. Thank you for the question. So the biggest single event that's going on is, well, it's already happened, took place at the Maine Memorial Mast in Arlington. I think Dr. Carney showed us some nice pictures of that. This morning, Rear Admiral Cox of the Naval History and Heritage Command and Mr. Bosanko of the National Archives, as well as a band and some other guests, laid a wreath, gave a speech as well at that. So that was the main thing. The other thing is Naval History and Heritage Command. We have published a number of articles on our blog, The Sextant, on causes of the Maine's explosion and some of the people killed. And then we also have done a update to the Dictionary of American Fighting Ships. This is a resource that the Navy History Command has online. So you look for DANFs, or the Dictionary of American Fighting Ships, and that gives official ship histories of all ships. And like I say, our one on the Maine was quite old, so we've expanded that out to be a lot longer and more helpful to modern researchers. So that's the main things.
Thanks. Steve, did you want to elaborate on anything else that the cemetery is involved in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Meg. First, on behalf of our executive director at the Office of Army Cemeteries and Army National Military Cemeteries, Ms. Karen Durham Aguilera, as well as our superintendent, Mr. Ray Alexander, we thank everybody for joining us today for this webinar. The one piece that Arlington is going to really continue to do throughout this 125th anniversary of the Spanish-American War is we have a really outstanding education module that's focused on the conflict. So certainly I would encourage anyone who is interested in employing those kinds of materials in a classroom, as an educator for students or for student projects, or just someone who's interested in visiting the cemetery, either in person or virtually, to take a look at those materials as well as the related walking tours, because they all really are focused on this 125th anniversary of the conflict and the Maine's destruction.
Thank you. I think the next one is probably also best answered by John. John, was the USS Maine built to fight, and how did it compare to vessels of possible opponents, including those from Latin American navies?
Yeah, good question. So I think, as I mentioned in my talk, this is a time of transition and a time of kind of expansion for the U.S. Navy. When the Maine is launched, everything else, well, when Maine and Texas are launched, everything else of the Navy is cruisers or smaller ships. In fact, the first steel ships that the Navy launched were only launched a couple of years before the Maine. They're the so-called ABCD cruiser, as named after Atlanta, Boston, and Chicago, I think. Anyway, so Maine, though, is different. It is armored, it is slower, has larger guns. So, it absolutely is intended as a warship. It is particularly so because it is built in large part as a response to I don't speak Portuguese, so sorry. I'll apologize in advance. The Rochelle, I think, which is a Brazilian warship built in the United Kingdom, but bought by and then deployed by Great Britain. And in fact, when Rochelle is bought, which I believe is in 1883, sailors, the U.S. sailors at the time realized, if the entire U.S. Navy went against the Rochelle, we'd all be killed. We'd all die from this thing. So the Maine is definitely a response to that. Actually, a lot of the design of the Maine is similar to that ship as well. Now, as far as comparisons to when the ship is actually done, it takes forever for Maine to be completed. So much so that by the time the Maine is actually commissioned, we have the Indiana class in the United States Navy that is getting close to being done. It's definitely in the yards by that point. Maine's about 6,000 tons. Indiana's over 10,000. They're the much larger things. And so even by the American Navy, Maine's almost obsolete by the time it's launched. Not quite, but it's getting there. Also, that's also true for the British Navy. The British Navy, of course, is the golden standard at the time. The Maine was launched around the same time as the Centurion and Renown classes, both of which are getting on towards like 11,000 tons, larger guns, faster, better armor. So even though the Maine is designed as a fighting ship, its likely opponents would have been considerably more powerful as that. So actually, that's why Maine is designated a second-class battleship rather than a true first class one that's supposed to go against the real battleships of the era.
Thanks, John. I think the next one I'm going to pass around several of you, and we'll start with Nate. Nate, can you share what your favorite book on the USS Maine and the Spanish-American War is?
Well, the one that I like is by David Trask, which is called The War with Spain. It's a very detailed book on the causes of the Spanish-American War, as well as the actual war itself. David Trask is a naval historian, and he's written one other major work on World War One. So,
thanks. Steve, same question.
So I would say that unfortunately, there really isn't a definitive work, certainly on the USS Maine. So I certainly would be an advocate for it's a good line of future research. I think there's a lot of gaps, holes to be filled in.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Dr. Carney here that the definitive work on Maine is yet to be written. Said Admiral Rickover's book that discusses the true cause of the destruction, written in the 70s, and it's got a solid, 60-page, something like that, history of the Maine, and then a good analysis of destruction. Also, what's his name? Sorry. Edward Blow's ship, A Ship to Remember. Edward Weems, excuse me, The Fate of the Maine. It's published in the 50s, but he's a solid historian and actually uses good sources. There have been a number of kind of more popular histories in recent years that aren't spectacular. So yeah, I would go with Weems as far as an actual academic one, although again it is dated, or Rickover. As far as the Spanish-American War, Ivan Muzikant's book Empire by Default is the best one I've found. It's quite good. So.
Thanks. Actually, I have a related question about this for Lynn. Lynn, can you speak to what records we have at the National Archives in DC relating to the Maine board? I believe that's referenced in Rickover's book, How the Battleship Maine Was Destroyed.
Oh, yes. There was reference to the Maine board. During the ship's recovery, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was called in to assist with the raising of the vessel. The board refers to a group of officers appointed by Brigadier General William Bixby. The records for those will be found in Record Group 77, Records of the Office of the Chief Engineer. And there are 2 boxes in entry 103 that speaks about the recovery of the vessel, the discoveries of the bodies. So that would be the main series I would recommend. There is also, which is not necessarily referring to Rickover's board, but there is also the Board of Inspections and Surveys, which also covers a good portion of the recovery. And that can also be found in entry 242 in record groups 38.
Fantastic. I hope folks have an opportunity to check those out. So the next question, I'm not sure who to toss to, but I'm going to guess either Steve or John. So the question is, can the USS Olympia, still on display, be considered a sister ship of the USS Maine?
Right, Steve's shaking his head no. Olympia is not a sister ship of the Maine. So obviously they're built within a couple of years of each other. Olympia though is a cruiser, and so it's not nearly as armored. I think it's about the same size, maybe a little bigger actually. But, it's a cruiser rather than a battleship. So faster, longer, less armor. That's it. So sorry.
No, that's great. And while I have you, do you know the answer? Who was the manufacturer of the engines and who retired after almost 14 years? That retired after almost 14 years.
So first up, the answer is on the DANF's, the Dictionary of American Fighting Ships webpage, so you can look it up there. But no, it is N.F. Palmer Jr. and Company. So those are triple expansion engines that relates to kind of how the heat That refers to how the heat kind of turns the turbines. There are multiple kind of turbines that goes as the steam goes out or whatever. I'm not an engineer, I'm a historian. So it's engines of Navy design built by N.F. Palmer and Company at the Quinyard Iron Works in New York. So New York built, Navy designed, and at the time they were capable of about 9,000 horsepower there. So that's what I know.
Great. Thanks, John. It does look like we're coming up at the end of our time today. So I want to thank everybody, both our panelists and everybody who's joined us for this virtual presentation. On behalf of the panel, Arlington National Cemetery, the National Archives and Records Administration, and the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, we appreciate your interest in America's documentary history, and we hope you enjoy it. You join us again. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.